for the presentation and discussion of Designing Against Evil, Breakthroughs in Violence Prevention. I'm Keith Krause. I'm a professor here at the Graduate Institute and director of its Center on Conflict Development and Peace Building, which houses actually the research project that we're going to hear about today and some of the key initiatives and findings that come with this. So I'm going to introduce our three speakers first before passing the floor to our main speaker, John Austin. And John is a recent doctoral graduate of the Institute. He defended his thesis in 2017 and has immediately thereafter started work as the lead researcher on what we call the Violence Prevention Initiative, either pronounced Viper or Viper, we haven't quite decided yet. And his own research focuses on what we would call the global ontology of political violence, which is a very academic sounding term, but is essentially focusing on pragmatic approaches for preventing war crimes and human rights violations, including such things as torture, targeting of civilians, genocide. And as this project unfolds, I think we'll be moving into other areas, including such things as police violence and other issues. So it's preventing violence in a very broad sense of this. There will be three short responses, I think, comments and questions that come from us afterwards. And we're going to start with Vincent Ballon, who is the head of the People Deprived of Liberty unit at the ICRC, the International Community of the Red Cross. And he has been working actually with the detention unit since roughly 2006. And has a great deal of experience in the field dealing with state authorities and concerned with things like access to people detained, pretrial detention, and complex humanitarian emergencies and other such contexts. And then we have Anna Leander, who will be the next discussant, who is joining us here at the Institute as professor in International Relations and Political Science in a couple of months in January. She's currently a professor at the Copenhagen Business School and also teaches at the Pontifical Catholic University PUC in Rio de Janeiro. Her work has focused principally in practical terms on private military and security companies, as well as drones, politics of knowledge, and more theoretically, some Bourdieusian or continental approaches to security challenges. And me, well, I just kind of chair panels like this, do the occasional bit of work on post-conflict peace building. So John is going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have responses, which will give us a lot of time, I think, for questions and discussion. Over to you.
Hello. Does this work?
Yes, sure.
Okay. So thank you very much to Keith and to everyone for being here. So yeah, as Keith just said, what I'll be discussing today is based really on the quite early stages of a new research project at the CCDP here at the Institute, and called the Violence Prevention or VIPE, etc. initiative. And as you'll suspect already from the title of the talk and other things, I'll be talking mainly about different kinds of political violence, torture, ethnic cleansing, or genocide even, the targeting of civilians and related phenomena. Things that are, colloquially speaking, called evil. Things that dwell in our nightmares, in places generally over there, rather than over here, in places like Geneva, which is supposedly nice and peaceful. Things that scare most of us. And I'll be exploring these phenomena by drawing on new perspectives from mainly within social theory, sociology, and as well as a little bit from within cognitive neuroscience. Ultimately then, I'll be trying to talk about how these new insights into how violence actually happens can lead us towards new ways of thinking about how we might prevent these things, just about stopping bad things from happening. And to begin today then, I want to start with this broader question of stopping bad things, with the very idea of prevention itself. And by broadening our discussion at the start, just briefly away from political violence, in fact, and looking at the idea of progress in human society, more generally speaking. So, arguably, one way we can recount the history of humanity is through a series of stories dealing with our collective attempts to grapple with evils, with those bad things, and to prevent them while allowing society to progress in line with whatever conceptualization one favors. To simplify very grossly then, building up world society into a state that is livable beyond a mere search for immediate survival has been about making pacts, agreements, with other humans about how to live, as well as slowly the expansion of those pacts beyond families, tribes, or small collectivities to nations, and today, hopefully, across transnational scopes. Typically, these agreements, whatever they might specifically be, treaties, normative commitments, trade agreements, whatever, have always involved commitments to refrain from destructive or violent acts whenever possible, as well as preventing other forms of avoidable injury, ill health, and an inability to flourish in the world. All these negative prohibitions can indeed be considered vital for any positive agreement for cooperation that one might make later. They've always been necessary first steps in making the world a better place. So, before getting to violence in a moment, I want to ask ourselves what progress, considered very simply as this process of stopping bad things, we have achieved over the last decades, centuries, or millennia. What things have we stopped to some degree in the last few hundred years of human civilization, or whatever time period we want to take? What are the indicators we have of any kind of progress in our lives compared to those of our ancestors? And I want to start with a very obvious one, infant mortality rates, which this graph shows quite neatly, the decline of infant mortality over time from 1850 to the present, or 1950, I don't think. You can see a measure of progress. Or we can talk about absolute poverty, not relative poverty, absolute poverty. Again, you see the line going nicely down. You have a kind of indicator of progress. Or a third one, levels of literacy, or conversely, levels of illiteracy. And in this case, you see the line going up, and you see progress of one degree or another. All these graphs then show a kind of progress over time. And the levels of these declines in bad things happening, in poverty, illiteracy, or mortality rates, of course differ depending on geographical location, and they may fluctuate now and again. But wherever one looks, they do generally decline over time. They have declined now and again, quite consistently, for various reasons which I won't go into. And so progress in that basic sense we identified, simply stopping bad things, has been achieved in one way or another. And more than that, this progress in human happiness, we might want to say, has been achieved remarkably quickly over the last 200 years or so, 200, 300 years. And of course, this is a very common story that I'm starting with here. Most of this progress can be associated to two things, colloquially speaking. First, to the rise of the Industrial Revolution, and second, to the spread of more modern, whatever that means, scientific principles. Two different things then, if we strip away the ideology here, occurred thanks to the Industrial Revolution and the rise of more positivistic scientific methods. First, ideas changed among people. People began to realize that people should be able to read. People should not necessarily die at childbirth and should not necessarily live in absolute poverty all their lives. They realized that all these things created greater evils and had to be dealt with. And most importantly, it came to be thought that human purposefulness itself could overcome these issues. No longer relying on God, whichever one, nor tradition, whichever one, people came to take the world in their own hands more than ever before. People came to believe that they could change the world. Secondly, to this spread of new ideas then, the material conditions of life changed. Due to rapid advances in technology, growing populations, and new organizational structures in states, among many other things, to put it very simply, more resources became available. We began more radically than ever before to exploit the earth and its population in ways that produced the necessary resources to, yes, reduce poverty, illiteracy, and death. And of course, if aristocratic or feudal society had remained in place, if we didn't have those new ideas about how to order the world, then even the presence of these new material resources may not have resulted in any change. But the contrary is also true. Even if we had these new ideas about how to order the world, new kinds of politics, many of them would have been impossible to achieve without these resources. So what I want to start with then is this idea that it was the combination between the free-ish development of new ideas and the emergence of the material conditions for their possibility, a kind of infrastructure on which these ideas could be built up, that made progress. And the world trade changed quite dramatically, both for good and for bad, because of these things. But of course, as I've said, I'm not really talking about progress today. I'm talking about those bad things, about evil, about torture, ethnic cleansing, as I've already said. But I want to talk about them in quite a different way to that we are used to, comparing, in fact, our lack of progress in violence prevention to our comparative progress in these other dimensions of social life. And in doing so, I'll return, and so I'll ask you to keep in mind these two conditions for the progress that we have achieved thus far. So let me turn now to what blocks progress, or simply to its opposite, the bad things which represent evil, things which a great majority of the people in this room, I would say, would probably want to get rid of if they could. So I'll start with torture, which is a quite unique evil, something that nobody really wants to suffer, and continue with another graph. This one is taken from Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature, and depicts the time in history at which various states abolished torture. And at first glance, the graph looks like we've made progress in this particular respect. The progress of eradicating the political violence of torture. It goes down nicely, mainly with European states, of course. However, we should be very clear that this graph charts only the decline in the legal sanction of torture. It says nothing about the actual frequency of torture or other forms of violence. And indeed, in 2014, Amnesty International recorded instances of torture still occurring in 141 countries, and another study noted that while almost all nation states do prohibit and condemn torture, almost all do participate in it, or at the very least are accused of it. So the persistence of the violence of torture is deeply alarming. It's a form of evil that has reappeared across history, and still today, indeed, you can find torture techniques that were used in ancient Greece or during the Inquisition being used in modern contemporary states. It's as if, in this regard, that history has stood quite still, at least if we look at what people or governments actually do and not what they say they're doing. And of course, the recurrence of war, civil or international, the perhaps only increasing targeting of civilians during conflicts, and other forms of violence all fit into this pattern. Governments may sign agreements, conduct negotiations, and appeal to their own respect for human rights, but violence always seems to be there, lurking under the surface, waiting to return. It may oscillate, its frequency may vary from year to year, from decade to decade, but it always seems to return, and often very ferociously. So the first question I want to ask today is how we explain this. How have we managed to eradicate so many diseases, so much hunger, even if much still remains, of course, and so much early mortality, and yet continue to kill, torture, and maim each other so rapidly? And one answer, which is surely correct, of course, is politics. People kill or do harm to others for innumerable different reasons, and normally they would explain them as being good reasons. As the Chilean poet Ariel Dorfman once put it, every government that engages in evil acts does so in the name of salvation. Some superior goal, some promise of paradise, call it communism, call it the free market, call it the free world, call it the national interest, call it fascism, call it the leader, call it civilization, and on. There is always this idea that people who do bad things are doing them for very good reasons, and there's a complicated politics behind this fact. People always think they are right if they have to fight or kill. There's always a justification of one sort or another, and that's without even getting into the larger questions of the political economy of violence. But is politics then the whole answer to why we haven't made as much progress as we would have liked in this area? I want to argue today that it's not. As we progress in this discussion now, drawing on the new insights I mentioned earlier from social theory, sociology, and beyond, and which suggest, in fact, a quite different way of understanding the recurrence of certain forms of violence in the world. To begin, however, we need to first focus on the fact that the puzzle of the recurrence of evil in contemporary society only doubles when we consider a key fact. The issue is not only that states themselves frequently say we do not torture, but that this claim has been demanded but it's been demanded that they make this claim by what is now a quite developed, even dominant type of politics. The politics of human rights, humanitarianism, and related fields. Thanks to this new kind of politics, we have international humanitarian law, human rights law, we have the ICC, and other organs of justice. We have 100 or 1,000 or more NGOs all working on these issues. And yes, these new ideas, and the definitely heroic efforts and very often self-sacrificing commitments that many show to them are a kind of progress. There is an ideational progress to some degree. These ideas, this new kind of politics provides a certain drive that we need to change the world. And indeed, Geneva here and the Institute itself is one key seat for many of these ideas for this new kind of politics. There are many different courses here, many different lecturers here all teaching on this subject. Hundreds of different elements making up these ideas: laws, ethical statements, treaties, advocacy work, and beyond. But what I want to say about these new ideas might seem slightly counterintuitive. There are today, I think, if anything, too many ideas here in this institute in Geneva and elsewhere for making the world a better place. Too many things people have to remember, to consider. Too many laws, too many advocacy campaigns, too many people pushing ideas forward. And to see why I'm saying too many here, let's go back to our discussion of what has produced progress for us in the past in certain areas and continues to do so. First, new ideas, and second, the material capacity to support them. The difficulty in violence prevention that I now want to stress relates to an imbalance between these two factors when talking about prevention. And most importantly, on the focus of most actors involved in violence prevention on creating ideas, endless ideas, and endless texts. And to demonstrate this point, let me ask two questions. What images come to our mind when we speak about progress in medicine, mortality rates, literacy, or anything like that? What kind of things come directly into your mind? Of course, you could think of somebody like Louis Pasteur working away at his desk and coming up with ideas, or some other such thinker who represents ideas behind scientific progress in these areas. But I would guess that we would also think much more simply and concretely about these things. We think about the drugs we take very often, about the libraries we grew up in, about the books we read, the black or white boards our teachers wrote on, or the hospital beds or beeping heart rate monitors that soothe our pain at certain points in our lives. All of these little objects are very concrete materializations of the ideas that help progress occur. They make those ideas concrete, and they make progress possible. They support them. They're the infrastructure that makes ideas happen. But now, if I ask what comes to mind when you think about any progress in eradicating phenomena like torture or the targeting of civilians or ethnic cleansing, it's much harder to think of similar material things that represent these ideas, this kind of progress. Of course, we could think about, say, a courtroom, for example, when somebody is prosecuted for what they've done. But that's after the fact, that's after the crime's already happened. Or we could think about the little books in which the UN Charter and the Geneva Convention are printed. But I at least can't think of that many material objects which represent prevention and human rights in a very concrete sense. And what I want to talk about now and throughout focuses on this very simple fact. When it comes to violence prevention, we already have most of the ideas we need. We have the appropriate discourses. But these ideas have no strong support infrastructure operating in a very strong material sense. So what we need to do then from the perspective of this project which I'm talking about, and this is not going against any other work in this area, is to build up this support infrastructure for human rights, humanitarian law, and related ideas in order to materially embed it in the world around us, so that when I ask that question, what represents, say, human rights in a material sense, it comes to mind much more easily. And indeed, the basic question, the importance of this basic question here is one of balance above all else. We can take a very crude metaphor here in terms of a set of scales. Here on this slide, we see notions of reducing early mortality, expressed both in terms of the ideas that lead to them, say germ theory, which produces scientific knowledge about this, the right to life, social contracts, etc., and on the other side, the materials that make them possible, drugs, maternity wards, incubators, etc. And all of the ideas are supported in the world in a very concrete sense. By contrast, in terms of preventing torture, we have a lot of ideas and we have only minimum material support. This is a bit exaggerated, but there's certainly a lot more ideas than there are material expressions of these ideas in the world. And so the project we're trying to talk about to some degree is focused on trying to address this issue or think differently about it. At least that's one aspect of the project. So, Why then is this idea of balancing between ideas and materials so important? Well, it becomes important when we realize that many violent human rights abuses emerge because there is a certain balance in their own conditions of possibility. Violence is very balanced in this regard. To stay with torture, this war crime is in perfect balance between its ideational justifications, why people justify it, and its material conditions of possibility. Of course, this might be quite hard to see in an abstract sense, so I'm going to take a slight interlude here, and I'm going to tell a story specifically about torture, which I think demonstrates some of these points. The story is a portrait of a young Syrian man named Berger, and his story begins in 2010, when, at 18 years old, he was conscripted into the Syrian army. It was dull, boring, repetitive, and violent, as he put it, so Berger spent most of his time reading novels whenever he could during his time off in the army, a form of escape that we bonded over during our conversations, over cups of coffee, trails of smoke, and this shared love of reading novels. But you all know what happened next, of course, in 2011. Revolution, uprising, civil war, whatever term you now want to give it, arrived. And Berger, after a few months, was then posted to a restive quarter of the city of Homs, fighting the now armed rebellion. And returning from fighting every day, Berger came to sleep in a former school that had been repurposed as a barracks and detention center for captured rebels. And he described it with the words, "You know when you go to school for the first time and you enter a new stage of life, it's strange because you have to start doing things differently. This was that, but different, everything changed." The building that he was living in was cement, crudely punched out with windows, and you entered under halos of barbed wire. Detainees were chained outside in the courtyard, men who had been rebels or just caught up randomly in things, hundreds or thousands, he didn't quite know. And the soldiers themselves slept in the old classrooms. It was in this building that Berger began his own process of transformation. And it was here, eventually, that he became what we would call a torturer. And getting to that topic, after our conversation passed beyond literature, he began by describing how the really bad things that happened there happened downstairs, underground. Every day, I had to go down those stairs to hell. It's a place in which you are not you, and the darkness gets inside you, as he put it. Downstairs to a set of interconnected rooms that made up the school's basement, and had been turned, he said, into concrete coffins, where faces gasped for life under pain, dozens of bodies and dozens of concrete coffins. Berger was 20 years old when, as he put it, torture first happened to him there. "I never wanted to do this, it just happened. We got it done quickly, maybe for them it seemed like a long time, but we did it as fast as possible and tried not to look. There was no plan to use torture, it just happened. It was improvised, we just used what we found and it just happened. Everything you need is around you, you use it like you've seen it before and go. It wasn't difficult, it just happened," he said. Berger's first torture victim was a captured rebel who was suspected of having information on the fighting positions of other rebels. He was taken to an underground room by Berger and 3 other soldiers. There, 3 of us, we pushed him into the room and onto the ground and handcuffed him. Then me and someone else pulled him up and hung him from his hands to a metal fixture on the ceiling. Then we started beating him. These words were spoken very slowly by Berger, as if he was trying to force these memories back. But the torture technique he was talking about was a very common suspension technique, common across the world and over time, and the beating he's describing is the slow, methodical, and centuries-old procedure of whipping, in this case with cables. And he described it with these words. "When I hit him for the first time, he gasped. He didn't scream, he gasped, like he was drowning. And the strange thing, I gasped too. That's what I remember." And of course this gasp, this convulsion of breath, this way in which we think about violences like this is something that affects us too when we hear stories from Syria or other places. Torture is a difficult thing to talk about and understand. And this particular conversation comes from a series of interviews I've been doing with torturers, mainly Syrian torturers, since 2013. And these conversations really sought to understand the how of torture in its very practical and material sense. I wasn't asking them really about the ideas underlying what they did, but how they did it, what they used to do it, and the very practical techniques in which they did it: facial gestures, conversations, tools, tool usage, etc. And to get back now to a discussion of balance between ideas and materials, I want to focus briefly on three aspects of the story which draw out certain things, two of which are key for violence prevention, I think. First, Werder did not want to become a torturer. He was unwilling. He disliked violence. And this, though I won't go into detail on it here, is true for perhaps 99% of people who get caught up in this. People don't like it. And that includes people who kill civilians, or those who engage in genocide, etc. They all begin as good people, and they don't want to do this. It's a myth, in fact, that people enjoy this in any strong sense, at least in the vast majority of cases. Second, despite this unwillingness to be violent, Werder could not explain exactly how he nonetheless became a torturer. As you remember, he said simply, it happened repeatedly. And of course, this claim will seem surprising, and most people don't take it very seriously. There's normally an assumption that people like Werder are lying. But there is good evidence for his claim that something simply happened, emerging from different social and natural scientific disciplines. Recently, work in sociology and social theory, for example, stresses how many practical activities are carried out by people like us, sitting in this room, me and you, quite unconsciously and without deliberate reflection. Not always, but sometimes. Sometimes things simply do just happen to all of us. And in cognitive neuroscience, in fact, this claim has also been confirmed or expressed quite differently with experiments based on the neural imaging of the mind, which show, in fact, that almost all decisions we make in life are made in our minds before we are consciously aware that we have made them. We decide what to do, and we think about it afterwards, in most cases. And indeed, much contemporary philosophy of mind draws on this neuroscientific evidence to suggest that human beings only rarely have free will as usually understood. What is suggested quite specifically is that when an event or situation emerges before a conscious person like you and me, an array of possible options, actions come to mind, without thought, reflection, or conscious deliberation. A repertoire of options simply appear. And for example, it's thus, if a fire breaks out, if you hear the fire alarm, you tend not to think too much. You go to the fire exit. Of course, in more complex situations, a wider array of possible courses of action come to mind. Nonetheless, for reasons about which neuroscience is agnostic, these options are already ranked to some degree in preference